Yeah, how about you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background in research?
Yeah. So my name is Silvin Willemsen. I have a background in physical modeling, musical instruments. So I did a PhD at Aalborg University in Copenhagen that I finished in 2021, and there the focus was real-time implementations of physical models on a slightly different technique than the one I use for atoms, but the principle stays. So it's the same principles in the end, which is physics and then generating sound from those physics rather than using samples or recordings for making your sound, for example. Cool. So yeah, I prepared a few slides to just take you through the behind the scenes or what is happening in atoms. And let me see. Yeah, so here we have the plugin as it is now. And yeah, so what we talked about, the main thing that Atoms is that it's a physical modeling synthesizer. So it creates sound based on physical equations. And this one specifically is based on mass spring system. So there's different techniques to physical model things or for physical modeling sound synthesis. But Atoms is based on mass spring systems or a mass spring network. And before we go to the network, I would like to just take the very simple case of a single mass spring system. And I promise that this slide will be the only one with equations and but after that we go a bit less technical. So we can take a mass which is of which its weight, so its mass is denoted by m, and a spring with a spring constant k. And then we have the mass, so how far it is from its equilibrium position, which we call the displacement, is denoted by u. And we can take these three things and make a differential equation. So here we have mass times the acceleration of u is the spring constant times its displacement, or that negative. So here we actually just have Newton's second law in a way. So we have mass times acceleration equals force. And we can see how if u is displaced from the equilibrium, this force will act upon the acceleration and the mass is going to accelerate upwards. And this is essentially all that a mass spring system is based on. So we relate mass and acceleration to force according to Newton's laws. And yeah, so this is the basis. So when we just have this single mass spring system, we get a sinusoidal oscillation. And this is also why a mass spring system alone is called a simple harmonic oscillator. So depending on what values you give to the mass and to the spring, we get a different frequency, for example. And depending on how far you pull away the mass from the equilibrium, you get a different amplitude of the sinusoid. Right, so now we have a single mass spring system, but we said that we want to create a network of these. So now we have a bunch of masses and springs connected to each other consecutively. So rather than a complicated network of all kinds of masses and springs connected together, we just connect them from a boundary, a spring, a mass, and then so forth consecutively to another boundary in the end. So this is kind of like a string-like configuration. And in the end, as you will use atoms, you can also hear that these string-like sounds that arise from this configuration. So the masses are, for example, able to move back and forth. So if you excite one mass, it will go towards another one. Springs will extend and contract. And so they will move, in this case, in one dimension, so along one dimension. And I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but this is basically what the eco mode does in atoms. So it will only move in a single dimension. If we turn off eco mode, we can move in multiple dimensions. So it can the masses and springs can also move up and down on top of left and right. And this is indeed when we turn off the eco mode. So you can get different like sonic qualities with both. But as you can imagine, if we reduce the dimensionality of the model, we need less computations, meaning that we can save some CPU there with eco mode turned on. So yeah, diving into the visualizer here. So the first thing that you might see when you open Atoms is that you see this visualizer window, and there's all these things happening, very like a dynamic visualization. But this actually directly relates to the physical simulation underneath. So essentially, what we see is a mass spring system. We have our masses and springs connected together, but kind of rolled up in a circle, or well, in this case, in this pentagon shape. But still, these are the physical or the simulated masses that we have in the backend, unwrapped. So even though you see a circle, they are still just configured like a string, as we said before. And finally, we are not visualizing all of them. So right now we're visualizing 5, whereas there could be, I don't know, 50 or 60 masses oscillating back and forth. But if we skip a lot in between, we get these very nice geometrical figures. And this is what you see, at least with this specific profile. All right. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is I want to go through all of these parameters that we see on the Atom's front plate and explain what they do in the simulation. Starting with the release. And the release is actually nothing but adding damping to the mass spring system. So as the masses move through space, and depending on their velocity, they're going to be damped. So, for example, like this, we have the masses going up and down, and the faster they go, the more they get damped. And this is, well, a physical thing that happens in real life too, is when you move something very fast through air, for example, it also gets slowed down more than if something moves very slow through air, which is why we call it air drag or viscous damping. And for higher values of release, we get a lower damping. So if you have the release all the way turned up to 100, we have zero damping, zero air damping in the system. And you could potentially get infinitely long sounds. When you put the release to 0, there's a lot of damping included, and we get very short notes. Yeah. By the way, feel free to stop me anytime if you have questions.
Sure. Yeah. So damping in this case, it's like sort of a slowing down of the masses.
Exactly. And also the amplitude is going to go down slowly. So it's kind of an exponential damping that you add to the system.
Got it.
Cool. So yeah, that was the mass damping. We can also add damping to the springs themselves between the masses. So as these springs extend and contract, we can also add damping to that. So the faster they contract and extend, the more damping will be applied to the system. And as it turns out, this acts as a low-pass filter. So it gives frequency-dependent damping to the system. And if you think about it, this might be logical because for higher frequencies, things vibrate more, they extend and contract more, meaning that those frequencies are going to die out sooner than the lower ones where you have not so much extension contraction. And this is what the order parameter essentially does. Then we get to the chaos, and I think that this is one of the most interesting parameters that we added because it adds a nonlinearity to the system. This is where it gets kind of the beyond physics thing that we talked about earlier. But to understand it, we first need to go into the normal case, the linear case. So as we saw before, we had a mass spring system with an equilibrium, and it gets pulled towards this equilibrium and just moves up and down, gets this very, has this very simple motion, and you get a simple sinusoid, the simple harmonic oscillator, as we said before. And again, this is just for a simple single mass, single spring. just to show you what this principle is. Then we can add a nonlinearity. So if I just let this play, we can see that around the equilibrium position, instead of pulling it towards the equilibrium, we are pushing away from it. So you're actually adding kind of two equilibrium positions around the original one, creating this sort of pulling zone, which is the normal zone, essentially, but also a pushing zone. So it pushes outward. And this creates a very interesting waveform already with the simple mass spring system, where here you can see it's going towards the original equilibrium, being pushed back, going beyond the original equilibrium, and going away again. So yeah, this introduces some nonlinearity, and can create some very nice things if we can also implement this in the mass spring network that we saw before. So here we have the usual case where all of the springs pull the masses toward each other. They all want to be at zero stretch, essentially. If we then add a bit of chaos, we add a bit of this nonlinearity component, some of these springs are going to push back. So it's kind of, you could see it as this a car suspension, for example. Like if you press it in, it's wanting to push back, but if you pull it out, it's also going to want to go towards that equilibrium position. So what then happens if we crank the nonlinearity all the way up? So we only have pushing motion. This can cause some buzzing sound, or like some kind of not unstable, because things are not exploding just yet. But you can get this kind of annoying buzzing kind of mosquito bee-like sounds. And this is why we implemented this kind of extra arc in this order. We implemented the order to be dependent on the current value of chaos. And we do this to kind of add some spring damping to the system so that we don't get this buzzing behavior. But this also means that this part of the arc, until the transparent one stops, will not have any effect on the sound. When you go beyond that, you will have more low pass effect again. But for higher values of chaos, we need higher values of order in order to keep the system acting normally. Yeah, so that is what this arc indicates. It indicates the minimum order value in order to stop the system from buzzing. And it will be higher for higher values of chaos.
Some people might like the buzzing. Who knows?
That is true. That might be for a V2 then. Maybe have a button that delinks it, I suppose. That'd be cool. But no, I thought personally it was very annoying. You should hear it actually one time. Cool. So especially in the 1D case, we have this buzzing. And the reason is that in one dimension, when there's a lot of kind of force outward in the system, the masses have nowhere to go. They are just stuck to this single dimension. And this is also why eco mode, if it's turned on, disables the chaos. It means that we have zero chaos. Order is in full range, but there's no chance for the system to go buzz, which is what we chose right now. Maybe in a V2 we can think about reintroducing it again, but for now we did it like this. So in the 2D case, there's a chance for lots of tension, meaning if the springs are all pushing outward, and now we have an extra dimension to go to, all these masses can now move outward. They can actually, you can lose tension. It's kind of like having too much string between the two endpoints. So it just kind of gets floppy, I guess. And this creates some nice kind of pitch gliding effect. So if you strike it, you will get your original pitch, but then it will detension over time. And you get this, pitch glide down in the frequency. And this is especially true for low frequency nodes. It also means that if you have higher values of chaos, your but when you play a C, it might be slightly below C. And this is also why we implemented the tuner, which I'll get to soon, so that even for higher values of chaos, you can tune your system towards a proper note again. All right, so now we move on back to the bottom panel, where we have a modulation parameter. There's three of these kind of dual knobs, and the left side of the knob is the depth, and the right side is the frequency of these different effects. So for the modulation, we can change the depth and the frequency of kind of where we listen along the network. So here we listen at almost the end of the mass spring network, but we can modulate that. So basically modulating the pickup position on a guitar, for example. And this kind of gives this nice like physical flanging effect, which is very interesting. And then the depth of this determines how far we go side to side, essentially. So along the same principles, we have the overtones, but instead of listening, it's where we excite the system. It's where we bow the system. I'm not so sure if I already mentioned that the excitation of this mass spring network is the bow. So it's kind of a friction model that we apply to the string.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is also where an additional nonlinearity comes from, and nonlinearities are what makes it sound organic and natural. And especially what I found with also earlier research is that the excitation is such an important part in getting this natural vibe, this natural sound, organic sound, I should say. But anyway, the overtones determines where we bow along the network. So we get a very dull or more dull sound when overtones is closer to 0. And when overtones is closer to 100, we get a very sharp sound. So more like a screeching sound. And this is also what you get when you bow close to the bridge or the nut of a string with a violin. You get more a round tone or a round timbre. You go more towards the middle, but if you go all the way at the end, you get this very screechy sound. And this is essentially what the high value of overtones also simulates in a way. Then we have the force, and this is directly linked to the force with which we bow. So higher values of force will put the bow harder on the string, essentially. And with this, you also get a more noisy, more screechy sound for higher values of force. And for lower values of force, you get a more roundish sound. Then we have the movement parameter. This is, again, one of those dual ones where we can change the depth and the frequency. And this changes the bow velocity. So it kind of modulates the velocity of the bow over time in a sinusoidal manner. So in this example, when the depth, so the left side of the movement parameter, is 100, we actually all the way stop the bow, go up, stop the bow, go faster, etc. For a lower depth, we are not stopping it all the way, so it's just oscillating the velocity while keeping a non-zero velocity, essentially. And then for depth of 0, we have a constant velocity. Then one more bow parameter, we have the attack. And this changes the bow force envelope or the gain envelope, depending on where in the range we are. So if the attack is lower than 50, we kind of hit the bow before we continue to continuously bow it. So we kind of have this bow force that ramps down from a higher force to its normal value. And this is what we can vary. So we can vary the force, but the time that it takes to reach normal force is fixed for an attack smaller than 50. For an attack larger than 50, we have a constant bow force, but then we have just a ramp in volume, I suppose. So we have we apply an input or an output gain to the voice, and then the time that it takes to ramp up to its usual gain, that is what we make variable. So for all the way up to 100, the attack, we have this darker red line. And for values closer to 50, we decrease the time it takes for it to ramp up. So kind of as your usual attack parameter after the 50 mark. All right, so we haven't talked yet about how to create different pitches for different notes. So what we can do to create lower pitches, for example, is to simply make the masses heavier. We can increase the weight of the string, essentially, as you would do with adding winding to strings, to heavier or to lower piano strings or low guitar strings. You don't change the length, you just make them heavier by adding this winding around the string. And that is, in a way analogous to what happens here. So this is one way, changing the mass or the weight of the masses. Another way is to decrease the length. So we can change the number of masses, which translates to changing the length of the system, which of course will give you a higher frequency for shorter lengths. So in Atoms, we're combining both of these techniques, and the maximum number of masses has to do something with the quality or the bandwidth of the simulation. And I don't want to give too many details here because it might get very technical. But what we chose essentially is a maximum number of masses, because you have to think about, if we add more masses, there's more to simulate, meaning that the CPU will rise almost proportionally to the number of masses that you include. So actually, this has something to do with a few settings of this profile, which is also in the bottom panel. So these two actually decrease the bandwidth of the simulation. So we get more of this kind of lo-fi vibe. I think the bottom right is titled lo-fi, the lo-fi profile. And what you also have with lo-fi music is that this bandwidth is being cut at some point. So you get this very low frequency, more dull, less sharp sound. And that is essentially what we're doing here physically. So both this profile with 50 masses maximum and the lo-fi profile with 25 masses maximum essentially do that. The other two are at a maximum of 100 masses. And I will talk about the bottom left profile in a bit.
Yeah, even the lo-fi mode just sounds so interesting. Like lo-fi,
awesome, cool.
It's one way to look at it, that it's lo-fi, but it's also just an interesting, different texture.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because the way that the physics turns out to be is, also, it's not only that the bandwidth changes, it's also, the more things than just that changes, because the bow stays the same, but bowing a smaller network also has something to do with different behavior. So everything is kind of connected in that way. Yeah, definitely. Then for the vibrato and the tuner, essentially what we do is we change the spring stiffness of the entire network. So it's kind of, turning up and down the tuning knob on the string instrument. And that is what we do physically here. So the vibrato is not a post-processing effect. It's really a physical implementation of a vibrato effect. Yeah, so then for the last profile, what you can now also do, now that you're virtual or digital, is to change the kind of the mass of the masses or the stiffness of the springs along the network. So right now we've only seen examples of the network where all the parameters are the same, no matter where you are. But you can also vary the mass or the spring stiffness over the length of the network. So you can make it thicker in the middle or thicker to the side, or make it more tense in the middle or to the side. And we experimented with a lot of different combinations of this, and we chose the one that we thought sounded very nice, which was decreasing the mass towards the right and increasing the spring stiffness towards the right. And this is what this profile does. So there's something additional going on in this one. And again, when you bow all the way here, differs or like makes a different sound again than if you bow in the center, even more so than what we've seen before. So yeah, this is a cool experiment that turned out to be nice.
Yeah, I'm starting to get a picture of how all the parameters interact, which I feel like
Yeah,
I could hear a little bit like some of the things you're describing, but it's so great to know exactly
yeah.
what the choices were. It's so interesting.
Awesome. Great to hear. I'm happy. I think it also gives you a better feeling of the instrument, which it kind of is, and how to kind of mold the parameters in a way that, like, I want it to sound like this. Now I have kind of a lead of where to go from with all the controls. Nice. So we have some post-processing effects. So we have a distortion, which is under drive, with some smart auto gaining. A wah-wah filter where we can toggle the resonance. So it's the only parameter that in its title it has an extra button here where we can increase the resonance of this filter. The space, which is a reverb, so we can change the wetness of the reverb and the size of it. And finally, just a simple master gain, which is the output parameter. So then something else that we added for the top 6 parameters is this automation menu or motion menu, where you can internally automate the parameters. So we have different shapes to choose from. You can have no automation, of course, but also sinusoidal or a sawtooth automation. A drift, which is kind of a random, it's sort of random, but not completely. It's also based on a physical model, actually, how it drifts, which was kind of cool, I think.
Yeah.
Then the trigger, which basically sweeps the parameter from the minimum value to the maximum value and just stays it and lets it stay there. And then the MPE, which appears in this menu if you turn on the MPE functionality in the top bar. And here it is then linked to per key aftertouch, kind of per key polyphony. So you can, for example, have different filter values for different voices that you're playing, depending on how hard you press the keys. Which I also thought was a very, very nice functionality to play around with. It's very, very makes it more natural even. Cool. So yeah, here we have a rate control, which applies to these parameters, these 4 settings. Then we have the value of the rate. So in this case, it's half a bar because it's synced to the host. So yeah, let me talk about that in a minute. We can copy paste the automation settings to another one of these 6 main things. So for example, if you're happy with maybe a saw like motion with a certain rate of the order parameter, you can click and drag it to your chaos parameter and it will go together right away. So for a workflow, from a workflow perspective, we wanted to include this one.
Yeah, very
yeah.
handy.
So this is that. Yeah, I was very happy that worked out. So yeah, this is that sync to host that I briefly mentioned. So the sync to hosts will sync it to the BPM that you have in your DAW or in your project, and then the rate will turn into a half bar, whole bar, a fourth, etc. Like that, depending on the measure on the beat. But if you disable this, the rate slider will be simply in hertz. So any value between 0.1 and 5 hertz, which is what you can change here. at least for the sine and the saw. For the drift, it's in percentages, so it will be more erratic for 100% and more smooth for lower percentages. And for the trigger, it will be in seconds. So you can set it to half a second, and if you press the key, it will sweep in half a second. Yeah, but again, if you press sync to host, it will do this in bars or in notes. And then here we have some invert automation. So for example, for the trigger, rather than starting at minimum, going to maximum, we do it the other way around. That is essentially what that does. Cool. Then we have some other controls. I can quickly go over these, but I think most of them will speak for themselves. So we have a root slider. So it transposes the root between -2 and +2 octaves. We have we implemented some smart randomization. So when you click on this randomize button, everything will be, all the parameters that you have unlocked. So you can edit what parameters are locked. Everything that's unlocked will completely randomize, including the automation controls from the previous slide, everything. If you are happy with one of these settings that you made, be it from randomization or from your own experiments, but you want to find variations on it, you can use this button, the iterate button. So the parameters will be slightly nudged, all the unlocked parameters will be slightly nudged with a maximum of like 10% of the entire parameter range, so that you get a variation of what you already have. So we thought that this was a very nice functionality too. And then, of course, we have an undo button, because there's nothing worse than clicking one too many times on randomize and losing your perfect preset. So yeah, the undo button is your friend in that case. Then we have this MPE button, so which stands for MIDI polyphonic expression, and it is linked to bow force. So if you don't enable the MPE on the force parameter, which is one of the 6 top ones, this will automatically be linked to the bow force. So the more you press the keys, the more force you will put into the system. So it's kind of like a volume control in a way, but of course, because it's a bow, it's non-linear.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just polyphonic aftertouch, just for anyone who doesn't know, it's like you can have a different articulation if you're pressing a key, for example, like in your left hand for the bass, you can press stronger, and that articulation will be only for that note.
Exactly. So every single voice has its own kind of expression possibilities. Yeah, definitely. We have an info button with which you can toggle tooltips. So every single parameter has a hover over tooltip. So to help you more than only this presentation, we have a mono/polyphonic switch. So we also have a monophonic mode. A panic button, where if you have these infinite sounds that I talked about before and you have no way to stop them, you can press on panic and all the voices will be turned off, which is very nice. And finally, a color theme switch. So we have a light mode and a dark mode, and you can switch this to your preference. Cool. All right. So that was basically it. I'll just quickly summarize everything that we've gone through. So these 5 parameters have something to do with the mass spring network itself. So the nonlinearity for the springs, the spring damping, mass damping, the different profiles we mentioned, and the vibrato, modulating the spring tension. We have some bow parameters, so the force, where we bow along the network, so the overtones. The first part of your note, the attack, how hard we bow, or if we have an input gain or a gain. Then the movement, which modulates the velocity. Then we have some post-processing, the distortion, the wah-wah filter, where we listen to along the network, which I think is some sort of post-processing. The space, which is a reverb and the master gain. And then finally, some other parameters, especially here at the top, which are more like control buttons and the root slider, of course. So this is the overview. And yeah, that was basically it. Thanks for your attention, Michael.
Hey, thank you. I'm really happy to learn this stuff. I think it's really interesting. I feel like I have a couple more questions if you got a little second, a little bit more time.
Of course, definitely.
Yeah, how, for example, would you recommend as the designer that like someone new to the plugin starts exploring it?
So the I think the main presets that the that Atoms will come with, I think, is a good place to start. And probably the titles of the presets will indicate a bit what kind of sound it should be and what you're looking for. Um, Mostly when I start using it, I start with the default preset and then go from there. Um, Randomizing is very nice. So just clicking the die a bunch of times and seeing if you get something cool out of it, then iterating if you're slightly unsure or if you want some variations. I think, yeah, the presets and randomization is the main starting point. And then as you get to know the instrument more and more, you can really shape the sound kind of intentionally. Like, okay, if I listen or if I put the overdrive on this or the overtones in the middle, I get a more round sound, for example. So I think that you should really treat it like an instrument that you learn to play and learn to control.
Yeah, and then I guess for one thing, I was just going to say I think the chaos knob is something that people have a lot of fun with because it really
Yeah.
starts to introduce those qualities that other kinds of synths don't have in any way,
Mm.
shape, or form. So I definitely think that's going to be interesting. I guess one question I had was, when you're dealing with these sort of systems of springs and masses, is there anything comparable in the world of real instruments that could be used as sort of like something
Mm.
to think of in your mind when you're working with atoms?
Yeah, so it's all on the basis of a string, essentially. So a bowed string. So you can turn down the nonlinearity all the way, for example, and get very, like, I would say, stringy sounds. Um, I think, yeah. So the basis is a string, and the chaos is the main parameter that makes it beyond that. Um, but I think just the fact that you can bow it and introduce nonlinearities with that, also with forces that are maybe not possible in the real world, or release times that are crazy, can make it also beyond the actual string. But as the basis, you could treat it like a stringed instrument. Yeah.
Anything else you want to say on atoms for new users or for synth fans or anything on that?
Yeah, I think, like, in general, like, have fun with it and have fun exploring. I think we try to keep the number of controls to a minimum so that it's not too overwhelming. But I still think that you can have a lot of control and a lot of, like, control over the sonic quality of the instrument. But I think you should really take your time exploring and really think, okay, what do all these parameters do if I have a low force or a high force, or like all these interactions between the various parameters? They can really bring something special, I think. And I think the randomize button is a very nice, nice way to do that at the beginning, at least. But yeah, have fun.